to No Nonsense Nonprofits. Hi, I'm Sandy Ray, founder of Sandra E. Ray CPA, where we alleviate financial headaches so that you can create a bigger impact. Today, we're going to be talking with Ashleih Cheshire, and we're talking about nonprofit risk strategies and insurance for nonprofits. And Ashleih is the vice president of property and casualty at Gregory and Appel. She's received her bachelor's degree from DePaul University and her master's from Butler University. She's actively engaged in Leading Age, and that is an Indiana Association of Home and Hospice Care. And what I didn't mention in your bio, Ashleih, is that your original background was in the medical field.
It was. I was actually, before I went into insurance, I did pharmaceutical sales for many, many years.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then just as a fun little note, Ashleigh's goal is to run a marathon in every state. How's that going, Ashleih?
I've done 20, so I'm getting
Wow,
closer.
that's amazing. That's
Oh,
amazing.
thank you. Thank you.
Good. Well, let's get right into some of the questions. Well, first, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you again for inviting me. I'm excited to, help anyone in your group with any insurance needs, because I know it can be a little overwhelming sometimes, especially if you have an agent that gives you an application. It definitely has many, many startups and organizations that have been around a little overwhelming. So I'm happy to be here to be an assistance to your group.
Well, thank you. Well, let's get into the questions. What types of coverage do nonprofits need?
So, as everyone knows, non-for-profits have very many different risks than your average business would have. But I'm going to discuss some of the major coverages, but also keep in mind that organizations will have different needs depending on the services that you provide. But majority of the coverages that everyone would need is property. If you own a building, you would need to insure that building. If you don't own the building, you also probably have like contents coverage that would be necessary. So that would be all of your things inside of the building. I always describe contents coverage as if you shake the building upside down, anything that falls out is what you need to cover. So that's kind of how I describe it to my clients. General liability, that would be any third party coverage for physical damage or bodily injury. So that is if a third party comes and walks into your business and they slip, trip, or fall and they bring suit against you, that's what that would cover. Professional liability, that word can be very fluid in insurance. Some people call it errors and omissions. Other people call it professional liability, but that just protects the entity and the employees for any negligence in the professional services that they provide. So if you're providing a service to the population, you want to make sure general liability necessarily wouldn't cover that. So that's why you need to have errors and omissions or professional liability. Auto liability, that's if you own an auto and it's titled under your organization's name, that just protects physical damage on that auto and liability. Also, if you don't own an auto, you also want to cover, it's called hired and non-owned auto, and that protects your employees who drive their own vehicles on behalf of the entity. Their personal insurance would be the first to respond, but your entity would also have coverage if their limits were exceeded.
I was going to the bank for when I worked for National Fraternity. I was going to the bank and got hit by a drunk driver. And fortunately, it was just a fender bender. But yeah, the company's insurance covered the damage to my car. The fraternity's insurance covered it, and I didn't have to do anything. It was wonderful.
Yes. Yeah. So that's something important. A lot of times, a lot of entities think, oh, I don't own an auto, so I don't need to have auto coverage, but that hired and non-owned is very important, especially if you have employees that are driving their own vehicles to and from locations. Crime policy, employee theft, which, we all love non-for-profits and we all think we're doing good and my employees would never steal from me ever. But unfortunately, it does happen. I've had clients, especially in the non-for-profit, who had thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars stolen from them right under their noses. So you want to make sure that you have a strong crime policy that includes employee theft. And you might want to, depending on the services you provide, if you're going into clients' homes, it's called third-party crime. So that would protect if any of your employees stole from your clients. So that can be another coverage in the crime that would be very important. Kind of the big coverage that all non-for-profits discuss is your management liability, and that includes your directors and officers coverage. So if you have a board, you 100% need a directors and officers policy, and it covers claims arising from your management decisions made by the board. So it helps protect your non-for-profit leaders from legal and financial risks. Those would not be, that's why it would not be covered under the general liability of professional. That's why it's very important to have a directors and officers. Also, under the management liability, we have employee practices liability, and that just protects from discrimination, sexual harassment, or wrongful termination if any of your employees bring suit to you from any of those issues. And the good thing about management liability with directors and officers and employee practices is that you can share a limit to help reduce cost at the beginning, especially with the startup. You can have $1 million policy, but it can cover both coverages. And that seems to be a good place to start, especially when you have a startup organization. Next coverage is cyber liability. That has kind of been the big one, especially since the COVID and everything going electronic and everyone going remote. And that just protects your entity from breaches in your information, and that's losses affecting first party, which would be your internal or third party information. And especially with non-profits, you're dealing a lot of time with donors, and they could be very large donors. So you want to make sure you have the appropriate limit to respond if you have a breach in any of your information.
Could you give an example of an external breach?
The big one recently, I'll kind of do what we've seen recently,
Okay.
is we've seen, it's called invoice manipulation. So one of your employees will receive an email and it looks like it's coming from one of your vendors. It's an invoice that looks exactly like the invoices that you have been, paying off of. You send the invoice to this email address that it looks like a vendor, and it's someone who hacked into your system and was able to manipulate or mirror exactly what your vendors look like. And then you just paid an invoice to a bad actor. That has been a big one. Another big one would be, they get into your system and they say, hey, it's such and such employee, and I just changed my banking. Here's my new bank information. Make sure all of my checks now go to this new bank. So those have kind of been on the rise. Now with the multi-factor, when you have to type in a code that comes off your phone, that has helped reduce some of those. But as we all know, all these hackers are becoming smarter and smarter every single day, and they're most of the time a step or two ahead of us. So it's not if you're ever going to get a breach, it's just when you're going to get a breach. And I want to say 60% of breaches happen with small businesses. So having the appropriate cyber liability is critical, especially in the environment we live in right now.
You hear on the news how AI is assisting those bad actors too. It's just crazy. So thank you.
Yeah, it's sad, but unfortunately, it's the world we live in.
Was
Oh, go ahead.
cyber insurance the last one, or is there more?
Just want to, just real quick, it's just workers' compensation. Now, every state has different laws, but most states, if you just have one employee, just one, you're required to have a workers' comp policy, because what work comp does is it protects your employees with any injury that happens on the job. Like I said, that depends on the state, what the state requires, but most states, if you have one employee, you're required to policy.
Yeah, and that's different than the state unemployment taxes. Not-for-profits many times have an exemption from state unemployment for, and again, depending on the state, for like 4 employees or less or whatever, it may be that the workers' comp requirements are definitely different than the state unemployment tax. And you think they're kind of related, but we need to be aware of what's going on with both.
Correct.
Okay,
You
great.
need to, yeah, it is different than the unemployment.
Okay, well, wonderful. Are there any specific risks that nonprofits face that are different from traditional businesses?
Yes, there are. One of the ones that we mentioned earlier is just the high risk of theft. And that's either from your employee, your client, or even a vendor. Because non for profits have such limited resources and their tight budgets, you want to make sure that you are properly insured to help transfer that risk. That if someone does steal from you, you have the appropriate insurance to help, you know, with those funds that you did lose. Because, like I mentioned earlier, you're probably on a tight budget and you want to make sure, $60,000 could really hurt the services that you're providing to the population. And then also, board of directors. I mean, that's huge. A lot of traditional businesses don't have a board of directors. And, they're in charge of your organization's mission, managing funds, and helping maintain those day to day expenses. But also, boards also, they take on a personal risk associated with their duties at that organization. So you want to make sure that most of them are volunteers, that they are not held personally responsible for any claims against that organization.
I know a couple of people who won't serve on a board, and when they're asked, the first question is, do you have D&O insurance?
And I mean, if you have a large board that have strong names in your community, yes, they should be asking the first thing, what does your D&O policy look like? What are the limits? Because every board member would be at risk, and you want to make sure that your limits are high enough for your exposures.
Wonderful.
Volunteers, I'm guessing most non-for-profits, it's their lifeline are your volunteers. But you also have to remember that if you have volunteers, they can also bring on additional risks. So non for profits could be negligent if a volunteer damages or even steals from another institution. And you do need to look at your policies, because sometimes policies will exclude volunteers. So you just want to make sure when you're reviewing those policies with your current agent that volunteers are not excluded. And volunteers can be covered under the general liability. It could be covered under work comp. It just depends on how the policy is written. So I would definitely make sure you review your policy related to the volunteers exposure.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that volunteers sometimes are excluded. I'm glad you said that.
And most of the time, if you have a policy that's specific for social services or non-for-profits, they won't be, but you never know. It's always just one of those things you need to be on the lookout for is, how are my volunteers covered under this policy?
Right, right. That's good point. Very good point.
Just your special events. You just want to make sure that where you're having your event, that it's safe, the property is going to be the right fit for your organization, and just make sure that your insurance coverage will cover where that special event is at, especially especially if it's offsite.
And I think a lot of times people don't realize sometimes these venues will require a certificate of insurance as well to know what types of coverage that we have.
Right. Yes, that's very, very important. And sometimes, and I get into this a little bit later, but just reviewing contracts, like, especially when you're small and you just let the big guy, you'll sign anything just to get this service available. And you want to make sure when you're dealing with larger organizations, they want to push all the risk on you, Well, you want to make sure you can push some of the risk on them. And it's just very important to review all your contracts, especially with your agent, to make sure the coverages and the limits that you have are what they're asking for. And if they're asking for waiver of subrogation or indemnity clause, you just want to make sure that it's in the best interests of your organization and not just signing it just because you need it so bad, which we see quite often. I always recommend, please remember this, to send the contract to your agent before you sign it, because you don't want to get in a situation where they're requiring some kind of wording and the carrier will not accept it. And now you're like, okay, now I have to look for another carrier or pay additional premiums. So you just want to make sure, if you have any contract, especially with insurance clauses, that you review it with your agent before you sign.
That's a wonderful tip, because I don't think most people think, okay, we're going to run it past the attorney, but they don't think about the risk management and the insurance piece.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it I cringe when someone gives me a contract that they've already signed and I'm like, okay, well, they won't give you those limits. So,
Oh, no. Oh, no.
and remember, insurance, we're on your side. I know sometimes people don't feel that way, but we are on your side and we want to protect your assets. So we just always want to make sure that when you're signing a contract, it has your best interest as well.
That's wonderful. Are there any other differences for non-for-profits?
Pretty much the big ones, I would say.
Great. So my next question is, what factors should a nonprofit consider when choosing an insurance provider or agent?
Ideally, you'd want an agent who has experience with non-for-profits, just due to the fact that non-for-profits have many different risks compared to a traditional business. And also, if these insurance agents have experience with non-profits, they can work with your organization to design an insurance plan that meets your need. Also, I would ask if the agent or the carrier has any additional services, especially when you're small and you're doing everything on your own. Ask if they have risk management advisors who can help you with policies and procedures, or a claims advocate who, if you do have a claim, they're there to assist you with every process during a claim. Because sometimes a claim can be very overwhelming, especially if it's a suit. I would always check to see if they have these added services. And they might also have HR support depending on what services the agency offers. If they have an employee benefits carrier or department, they could have HR support to help it all. And, keep in mind, are these extra services, are they additional fees, or is it included in me being a client of your agency? And lastly, kind of what I just talked about earlier is just, I think it's very important to have an agent who can review any contracts with insurance requirements, because this can be very important to your organization when you're trying to transfer risks. So those would kind of be the main points I would recommend when looking for an agent.
Thank you. That's very helpful. What can nonprofits do to mitigate their risks?
Yes, I think, like I mentioned earlier, like if the agent has like a risk management team, I would always recommend like sitting down with the risk management team and saying, okay, let's identify and prioritize what different types of risk my organization has. Look at those risks and make sure that the insurance limits reflect what those risks are. For example, what age group will you be servicing? Are you servicing children? If you're servicing children, are you servicing them one-on-one? Are you servicing them in a group? Whatever risk you have, what kind of like sexual abuse limits do you have? You want to make sure that you're not getting a $10,000 sexual abuse limit when you're servicing children, which that wouldn't even include an attorney fee if you were brought suit.
Mhm.
Also, look at your organization's internal controls. This kind of goes back to the crime. Are you requiring two signatures on the check over a certain amount? Are you having your board members review your financial statements? Are you adopting a conflict of interest policy? these are all ways that you can help mitigate your risk to make sure that you are not the next organization with a huge lawsuit against it. And then lastly, I know I've said this over and over, but it's just transferring risks by reviewing contract language and the insurance requirements. I guess if one nugget you get from all of this would just be your contract reviews.
Yeah, that was an epiphany for me too. I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you wanted to mention?
I mean, all in all, I would just say look at different insurance programs and keep in mind that your organization, make sure that your organization is properly insured with the appropriate limits for all of your exposures. And we'll mention this, but I'm more than happy, if somebody wants just an insurance review, I'm more than happy to look at your current policy to make sure that you have the correct limits and coverages for your exposures. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, I want to mention if you do have any questions for Ashleigh about this, or you would like the review that she's offered, her email will be in the post, but it's also at acheshire@gregoryandapel.com. That's ACHESHIRE at GREGORYAPPEL.com. Thank you, Ashleigh. I really appreciate you being here with us today. There's so much wonderful information.
Thank you again for allowing me to speak with everyone. I appreciate it.
We hope that this was helpful for you today. And if you have any questions about this or other topics, please put something in the comment section or email Ashleigh directly. And remember, we always appreciate your likes. We want to thank you for joining us today, and remember that creating a bigger impact starts with stopping the nonsense. If you're dealing with nonsense in your nonprofit organization, I'd love to help you cut through the noise.